Have you ever really just wanted to prove someone wrong? Or ever wondered whether you were wrong but didn't know it? Have you ever been in a situation where you're like, I am 100% sure I am right, and then found out you were wrong anyway? Or someone is telling you that they are 100% right, but they are wrong anyway? Epistemology is about exactly that, knowledge. How do we know things? What do we know? And how do we find the truth?
But before we begin, I just wanted to let you know about my free webinar, which will help you plan your philosophical studies by helping you avoid mistakes and apply best practices, as well as providing an example reading list and structure so that you can begin your philosophical studies. Now, back to the video.
Epistemology is a combination of two ancient Greek words, episteme and logos. Episteme meaning knowledge and logos meaning reason. Much of epistemology owes its origin to Plato, who really was one of the first to question what separates belief from knowledge. If I have a belief in something and it turns out not to be the case, we would like to say that there is a separation there between my having a belief and it actually being correct. We would usually say that one was knowledge and one wasn't. And I could have a belief that there was unicorns outside, but that would not be the same as me knowing. Plato was the first to really show that they have to be separable, that it's not enough for it to simply be the fact that I happen to be correct, but rather I have to have some reason to think that I am correct. Justification. Justification holds a pride of place within epistemology. What warrants justification? What is justification? How do we obtain it? How do we test it? So what are some of the most common epistemological theories? The most common is correspondence. Correspondence is probably what you think of in terms of knowing something. Most people, including philosophers, affirm a correspondence theory of truth. Correspondence theory is really focused on whether propositions obtain reality, whether these truth-apt statements obtain what are called truth makers, and those truth makers are found in an observable external reality. Now, that reality does not have to be external. It's not necessarily making a metaphysical claim, but most people who believe in correspondence are realists. Most people who believe in correspondence will usually affirm that there is an external world and we are correct if our propositions obtain truth value from that external world. If you say it's raining outside, and it actually happens to be raining outside, then you've obtained truth value. Now, there are a priori truths, which may not fall into this category. You could say, well, how does 1 + 1 = 2 obtain truth value from an external world? Now, you could either be a number realist and say, actually, there is an external world in which this is necessarily the case. You might be affirming that either correspondence isn't the only kind of truth, or that this corresponds to logical reality or logical interrelation between ideas, and still sort of hold a kind of correspondence conception of truth. It's not necessarily making a claim about what constitutes justification, but rather what constitutes truth. Coherentism, for the longest time, used to be the most popular alternative to correspondence. Correspondence being an obtaining of reality, where coherence is as it sounds. To make something coherent or compatible, a proposition would no longer obtain truth value from a truth maker which is external. It would obtain truth value from another proposition. The sky is blue would obtain truth value from the proposition, this is the sky and it is blue. So it's more about a coherence within a line of reasoning which circles back round and justifies itself. Coherentism comes in a great deal of many forms. You get coherentists who essentially affirming maybe a phenomenalist conception of reality. They would say that everything is language, like Wittgenstein, or they may be like Heidegger, where they're existentialists. They're saying that reality is built up of underlying foundational belief structures and precepts. These fundamentally constitute propositions within the agent which construct the world, and so there is this web, this conceptual web, which is essentially stringing itself together. And what you're trying to do is create a parsimony, a coherent structure which doesn't contradict itself. And if it does contradict itself, it needs to be reevaluated. Deflationism is now more common, specifically in analytic philosophy, than coherentism. Deflationism is a theory that says for something to be true, it's the same as simply asserting the statement. It's an assertion of a belief state. There are a few different types of deflationism, but they all basically agree. They take this all to boil down to language, a grammatical statement, which is simply an assertion of something being the case. Straight up, the sky is blue. Why? Because the sky is blue. So you can see there's a level of circularity there that just they believe cannot be overcome. Rationalism. Rationalism is a theory that truth is reducible to intuition or to reason, that everything is built from foundational ideas about the world, specifically in terms of logical deduction. The most famous being Descartes, and then Spinoza and Leibniz argue from first principles downwards. Now, rationalism is typically associated with metaphysics, either a dualist conception of metaphysics or an idealist conception of metaphysics. This was most popular in the 17th century, specifically in Germany, and directly opposed to what was called the empiricist tradition. Both are kind of spawning from the same Protestant bedrock, one going one direction and one going the other. There's different reasons why. The rationalists, they believed in abstract objects, things like numbers being real. They might argue that there are rational existent forms or universals. Well, an empiricist would be more inclined to affirm that all that exists is a particular. And this is the Protestant nominalism. So the Protestant Reformation rejected Aristotelianism. Aristotelianism is kind of in between these. One went one way, more towards like Plato and exaggerated realism like Descartes, and one went another way, the nominalism and sort of particularism that you see in someone like Abelard or Rosalind. All that exists is particulars, and from that we gain knowledge. And this is really the birth of empiricism, and actually the birth of contemporary science. Well, kind of. Contemporary science can really see its birth between these two traditions, which is why there is a great deal of mathematics, and you get people like Leibniz debating Newton. Empiricism literally meaning of the latter. The idea behind an empiricist was to say that we gain something from observation, not before, but from the latter. So not from a priori, reason, but from the latter, empiricism. So the empirical, the a posteriori, that which is gained through observable experience, led to a discussion of what was called sense data, which was often seen as the sort of bedrock of knowledge, that everything could be reducible to sense observation. Things like the laws of logic, which would be deduced from constant conjunction with what is called rational induction or induction. Because I've experienced something 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times, I have more and more reason to believe it is the case. The sun is likely to rise tomorrow because every day of my life it has risen. This actually ends up causing a big problem for the empiricists, but kind of cyclic problem in which they are unable to essentially find in observation the reason necessary to justify their observations. And you find arguments against this quite often. They're the main two theories of truth that were around the 17th century, and they are still incredibly popular today. You will still find empiricists and you will still find rationalists in both the analytic tradition and the continental tradition. In betwixt these positions, if you will, was pragmatism, American pragmatism. American pragmatism is actually really rather interesting and was neglected for quite a while, but pragmatism has since been revived and has become more common. Some of you individuals like Rorty and Putnam, what they all share, that truth is agent-centered. For something to be said to be true, it's not enough to say that it either corresponds to reality or coheres with a belief, but that it actually has some pragmatic importance towards the life of an individual actually trying to achieve something. And this essentially is a sort of tying of ethics specifically to truth. You can see something similar to this even in Aristotle, where all men desire to know. This idea that desire and knowledge are inherently tied together, where something can only be said to be true or not true in relation to my inquiry into truth. Even things that may seem useless often can be reduced to the fact. And so it's this inherent connection between ethics and epistemology, essentially, that pragmatists are affirming. Pragmatists typically don't affirm that there is an objective reality that can be knowable external from our subjectivity, because our subjectivity is bound into truth. You will find that pragmatists, and Robert Brandom argues this, leads back to German idealism. It might not be that there is non-agent centered truths, or that there are these mind-independent truths that maybe something like Correspondance would argue, but you may find an objectivity to truth. Pragmatists don't normally go that far, but I'm just showing that there is a very close similarity between pragmatists and idealists. This ethical relationship to our agency and our attempt to know implies a kind of teleology, which can be expressed in something like a Christian approach, where this is actually a relation to God. Some pragmatists will argue that it is an evolutionary development. If you're in the woods, you're in the forest, you're in the jungle, you're trying to feed yourself, now you're going to start caring about the truth. But without such agency, you wouldn't be able to do so. It all boils down to a kind of pragmatic value. This, I think, actually causes problems, because you end up with issues like, well, how do you know that evolution is valuable if you remove the agent-centered, like, why should I believe in evolution in the first place? And they'll just say it's agent-centered. But yeah, often pragmatism is argued for from an evolutionary standpoint as well. So hermeneutics, the philosophy of interpretation or meaning, the argument within hermeneutics is that the world is structured in many ways like a language. When we try to obtain an understanding of truth, we do so through our understanding of a reality. We take a proposition, something that we think is true, and we'll attempt to apply that to reality. And so we have a relation between precepts and concepts. Precepts are our prejudices, are sort of the underlying patterns of our thoughts, and then you have our concepts, applied reality of that intuition, of those thoughts, of those precepts. In applying those precepts, we gain this loop, which is called the hermeneutic circle, which causes a reevaluation. So our precepts are challenged by our concepts, and our concepts are essentially formed by our precepts. This feedback loop which moves us closer and closer to truth. Now, this might sound like coherentism, and for some people, it is coherentism. For others, it's not necessarily coherentism because of the differences in metaphysics. Hermeneutics is very much against what is called Foundationalism. Foundationalism is the argue that there are foundational beliefs from which everything is built upon, and that those foundational beliefs are essentially the bedrock of everything we can know. A rationalist would argue that this was an innate idea. An empiricist would argue this was sense data. These would be like foundational ideas or foundational experiences, beliefs, whatever. A hermeneutic theory of truth would argue that these are themselves changeable and actually are mediated, meaning that they aren't unchanging themselves, that they aren't able to simply prove themselves. They cannot be asserted as proven by themselves. It was actually created by people who wanted to understand the Bible literally. They wanted to gain the perfect conception of the Bible, but realized that they actually couldn't without taking the entirety of the context of the piece into consideration. What they realized is that, well, the context of the piece is developed from reading the piece, and reading the piece is developed from the context of the piece. I can't understand, let's say, the trials of Job without understanding God's creation of man in Genesis, and I can't read them separately. There is this connection between the stories. There is this underlying meaning of the Bible, not contained in any given particular part of the Bible, but in the totality of the Bible. So if I read the Bible once, I might gain an understanding of the different sections of the Bible. Until I've read them all, I won't understand the complete whole of what the Bible is intending to convey. And it's not even just the Bible, it's everything. Sentences, the smallest linguistic structures require this level of interpretation and translation. Now, you can see that this is really useful even in terms of how we understand scientific experimentation. It's not just enough to do the experiment and observe the data. I take the data, I use it to reevaluate, restructure, create a new experiment. It's not just enough to say the world is made of atoms, but rather I need to understand how I even gain greater and greater insight into how to observe the world. So as you can see, this isn't something that can be seen as rationalist or empiricist, but is in many ways a kind of relation between the two. It's not some sort of objective mind-independent reality. The agent is part of it. However, that doesn't mean there isn't truth to find. In my application, I am gaining useful, concrete information. There is an objective truth to the world. It's not like I simply perceive it as it is, but there is a truth. It might be the truth of the self, it might be the truth of God, but this is how I learn it. As I said, this is contrary to what's called foundationalism, a theory not of truth itself, but of epistemic justification. Essentially, everything can be boiled down or reduced to a fundamental that simply is. It might be a brute fact, it might be an innate idea, but it cannot be proven by anything else. It is not mediated, it is immediate, and is the foundation of all of that truth. And it doesn't have to be a simply one truth, but this is essentially the bedrock of all truth. It all reduces down to a foundation. Now, hermeneutics would say that that is not correct. To understand that foundation, it'll have to be mediated itself. If you were to write a syllogism for this foundational truth, you would still need to prove the second premise, and you'd have to show that logical interrelation, that it's actually that way. And in order to do that, you are going to have to affirm some other truth. Now, you could end up saying that there are mediations between sort of necessary truths. That would be fine, but it wouldn't be foundationalism. It wouldn't necessarily be coherentism either. You might see this as something more like as a middle way, which is called Foundherentism, which is a kind of like there are foundational truths that are coherently structuring each other, and it is this interrelation between these foundational truths. It allows for more breathing room, if you will. I can go out in the world, and it's the fact that I can broaden my horizons and engage in a way which maybe goes beyond what a coherentist conception would allow for. You have to understand how each theory or each theorizer specifically structures their arguments of how we gain truth and knowledge. That's what epistemology is essentially trying to arm you to do. You should be able to go away and question, when this person makes a claim, what are they appealing to? If they're appealing to an experience or the experience of others, they might be a correspondent. If they are appealing to rational necessity, they might be a rationalist. Maybe they're appealing to both, something like a Foundherentist, maybe engaging in hermeneutics. Look to what people are appealing to justify their arguments. Is it logical necessity? Are they showing that it must be the case? Is it experience? Is it something in between the two? Is it something else entirely? And maybe you've never heard of it before. Is it the pragmatic value in affirming this to be the case? You could even see the differences that it makes at a political and a cultural level in terms of ethical agreements, how they structure their lives in relation to what they take to be true and normal. Thank you for watching this lecture. I hope you've enjoyed it. The next lecture will be on ethics.